The Council voted today to impose sanctions on Libya to force it to surrender 2 suspects in the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. The vote was 10-0 with 5 abstentions. The sanctions prohibit flights to Libya except for humanitarian reasons, and they stop shipment of aircraft supplies and components. They also outlaw sales of weapons and military equipment to the country and call on UN member states to expel most Libyan diplomats. The sanctions are scheduled to take effect April 15th.
The international community is sending 2 clear signals. First, that it will not tolerate such threats to international peace and security. Second, that it is prepared to take concerted political action against the continuing defiance of international obligations and norms of behavior represented by Libya's state-supported terrorism.
The 2 Libyan suspects have been indicted by Britain and the United States. 270 people died in the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing. UN officials say Iraq again is shelling its Kurdish population, thereby violating more Gulf War ceasefire terms. They say it's in preparation for a major offensive. Wolf Blitzer reports the Pentagon is watching the situation closely.
Fighting between Iraqi forces and Kurdish rebels has significantly intensified in recent days. Pentagon officials say Saddam Hussein has moved heavy artillery and thousands of troops, including some elements from his Republican Guard, toward the Kurdish-controlled areas of northern Iraq. They do not believe the Iraqi troops will risk U.S. military intervention by driving their forces much more deeply into the Kurdish zone, which runs north of the Sulaymaniyah, Erbil, and Mosul Arc. The officials say the Iraqis are flying lots of gunship helicopters, but below the 36th parallel, which the U.S. says is okay.
We have no documented instances of Iraqi military forces violating either the security zone or the no-fly zone.
The president of the Kurdish National Congress has just returned to Washington. He says his people fear the worst.
There is constant bombardment, artillery shelling on their villages, and they see the tanks coming.
On Capitol Hill, key congressmen predict it's only a matter of time before the U.S. has to intervene.
I don't see how we can avoid a showdown here at some point. At some point, the last straw will be just enough to break the camel's back, and we will have to use military action.
We simply cannot allow the gangsters and the hoodlums of the international community, the Saddam Husseins and the Gaddafis, to kill and maim and murder with impunity. Those days must be over.
U.S. military forces in neighboring Turkey are closely monitoring the escalating fighting. They have warned Iraqi officers during regularly scheduled meetings in northern Iraq to comply with UN Security Council resolutions prohibiting repression of the Kurds. Pentagon officials say the Iraqi objective is to intimidate the Kurds into canceling plans for elections to establish their own parliament and eventually an independent state. Given the region's oil wealth, they say Saddam Hussein can be expected to continue to fiercely challenge those plans. Wolf Blitzer, CNN, the Pentagon.
In France, speculation is high that Prime Minister Edith Cresson is on her way out after the ruling Socialist Party's poor showing in regional elections. President Francois Mitterrand consulted with cabinet ministers throughout the day, and he canceled their usual Wednesday meeting. Some observers say Mitterrand may announce Cresson's dismissal in the morning. In Russia, President Boris Yeltsin has taken another step to guarantee stability in his country. The leaders of 18 republics within Russia signed a treaty giving them greater autonomy. Yeltsin says the agreement will protect against the old bureaucratic supremacy of Moscow. 2 republics refused to sign. Elsewhere in the Commonwealth of Independent States, stability is nowhere to be seen. Fighting is reported in Moldova, Georgia, Tajikistan, and in the Russian region of Chechen. In Moldova, ethnic Russians who want to secede from the republic clashed with Moldovan loyalists. At least 2 people were killed, 13 were wounded. In Chechen, which refused to sign Yeltsin's treaty, the parliament has declared a state of emergency after government opponents seized communications facilities. The White House says President Bush will unveil a good, strong economic package for Russia tomorrow. It's expected to include $12 billion in loan guarantees and $1 billion to stabilize the ruble. The president's been criticized for inadequately supporting Russia's democratic reforms. The breakup of the Soviet Union and U.S. defense cuts have signaled the end for the USS Missouri. America's last active battleship was decommissioned today for a second time in ceremonies at Long Beach Naval Station in California. Mighty Mo has an historic past. It's where Japan formally surrendered in 1945. In Miami, one more day of closing arguments is expected before the jury in Manuel Noriega's drug trafficking trial gets the case. Today, prosecutors describe the former Panamanian dictator as a crooked cop who sold military protection to the Medellin drug cartel. The defense is expected to wrap up 7 months of proceedings tomorrow with its closing arguments. To help build the prosecution's case, U.S. intelligence agents searched Manuel Noriega's homes for evidence after the invasion of Panama. CNN has obtained exclusive photographs taken recently in one of those homes. John Zarella reports.
It is called La Escondida, one of Manuel Noriega's retreats. It sits on more than 100 acres nestled in the mountains of the remote Chiriquí province of Panama. Noriega had a small zoo on the property which included endangered animals. Recently, a team of wildlife experts from the United States was allowed to visit the home in order to study the animals. 2 members of the U.S. team spent the night in the house and were allowed to record these pictures. Although on trial in the United States, Noriega is ever present in the house.
There are pictures of this man everywhere. Any place that you can sit in that house, that you can sit down, you can pretty much see a photograph or painting of this man looking at you.
The pictures, even those with his wife Felicidad, usually show Noriega in uniform. But there are 2 of the general as a small boy, perhaps not older than 6. Contrast those with a bizarre painting hanging on the wall.
This one painting that he has, where he has his face painted inside of a human heart, and it's suspended by rosary beads by the white dove of peace, and it's surrounded by all the planets of the solar system. I mean, you see Saturn with the rings, all of them there, and he's like in the center of it, and on the bottom it says, "For eternity."
Noriega is everywhere, his face etched in the sets of drinking glasses, his chair with the name Tony inscribed, another with the initials M-A-N, man, for Manuel Antonio Noriega, a belt with his name on it. The home also has many stories attached to it. Although no evidence has been found, it is said Noriega tortured and murdered his enemies here and hid millions of dollars on the property. The servants told McGill it's not true.
They have searched that property up and down, and nobody's ever found anything.
His books tell a story, too. Hitler, Himmler, Mao, and Che Guevara. Noriega is said to be a history buff. His wife, a hat collector, evidenced by the rack. And hanging outside the house a sign, perhaps a bit ironic. It reads, "Welcome to all who bring peace." John Zarella, CNN, Miami.
Mike Tyson will remain in prison while he appeals his convictions for rape and criminal deviant conduct. Today, the Indiana Court of Appeals rejected the former boxing champion's request to be freed on bail. The court didn't explain. Tyson's attorneys are expected to appeal the decision to Indiana's Supreme Court. A U.S. Supreme Court ruling could affect school systems nationwide. By a unanimous vote today, the justices voted to lift court supervision of student desegregation in DeKalb County, Georgia. The decision means school systems can be declared legally integrated on a step-by-step basis, even though some degree of racial inequality may exist. While DeKalb County doesn't have forced busing, the ruling could provide school districts with a way to end busing before they meet all aspects of a judge's desegregation order. The White House is refusing to answer to Congress about its travel budget. 5 administration officials ignored invitations to testify today before a House subcommittee. So Democratic representatives addressed their questions to empty chairs. They say the White House conceals much of its travel budget in military accounts. And they complained about the president's 5 florists and 5 calligraphers. Republicans didn't buy it.
This is politically motivated. There's no question about it. They're trying to divert attention away from the scandals of the U.S. House of Representatives down to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to get this monkey off their backs.
The administration says officials already have defended their budget to Congress. Vermont's voters began gathering in presidential caucuses an hour ago. President Bush is unchallenged in the Republican caucuses. Very early Democratic results show Jerry Brown with 6 delegates, Bill Clinton with 1. Former candidate Paul Tsongas has picked up 4 delegates. 3 will be uncommitted.
So you
The former California governor told union leaders today Bill Clinton stands for a, quote, low-wage, chummy old boy network. And then Brown returned to New York for a debate, a doubleheader with Clinton. The Arkansas governor denounced the Bush administration's policy toward Israel. He told the Jewish group U.S. pressure on Israel to stop building settlements had severely damaged relations between the countries. Brown says Clinton's newfound willingness to debate is a mark of desperation. But the frontrunner says he's just trying to bypass the Big Apple's tabloids. More from Richard Roth.
It's getting so you can't tell who is Bill Clinton's opponent in the New York primary.
CNN Headline News. I'm Lynne Russell. A quiet Tuesday night in Campaign 92. The lone presidential contest is in Vermont, where Democrats and Republicans are caucusing. Only 14 Democratic and 19 Republican delegates are at stake. No results in the Republican contest yet. Let's have a look at the latest Democratic delegate counts. With 43% of the precincts reporting, Jerry Brown has 6 delegates and Bill Clinton has 3. Paul Tsongas, who dropped out of the race and wasn't actively campaigning, has no delegates so far, and uncommitted. There are 4 delegates uncommitted. These numbers will fluctuate as the evening wears on. Both Clinton and Brown are concentrating on New York, which yields 244 delegates next week. Gene Randall reports Clinton is rethinking his strategy.
Their own poll numbers apparently reflecting a close race with Jerry Brown here in New York. Highly placed Clinton officials are beginning to downplay the need for a win in next week's primary.
Toward the end of a primary campaign, we're not quite at the end yet, but toward the end, the nominee generally loses a couple of campaigns. It's just what Governor Clinton calls buyer's remorse. Just as you buy that new Buick, just as you drive off the lot with it, you look at that Oldsmobile and you think, well, they look pretty nice too.
The Oldsmobile is Jerry Brown, who ironically won 3 late Democratic primaries in 1976 when Jimmy Carter won the party's nomination. Clinton officials have been escalating the number to 5. Still, New York has been troublesome to Democratic frontrunners in the past. The best example, Jimmy Carter as an incumbent president finished a distant second to Senator Edward Kennedy here in 1980.
Bingo.
At the same time, some political experts say a Clinton defeat in New York would be costly.
A loss in New York is a problem for Bill Clinton. It's a serious embarrassment. It could be worse than that. But it would still leave him in place as the front runner and the likely, if seriously damaged, nominee for the Democratic Party.
Bill Clinton, meanwhile, complains there's been too little media scrutiny of Jerry Brown. He says he's been victimized by the New York tabloids, and he claims he is fighting a mindset.
It's a psychologically damaging position of being the front runner, being turned into being the establishment, part of the problem. And I think the only way to avoid that is to stay on the toes of my feet and be on the offensive.
That offensive includes a series of debates with Jerry Brown.
Hey, there's a little rule in politics. You never debate a challenger until you're a loser. And that's the category he's now falling into.
Clinton also fell into the category of Patient Tuesday. The report is he visited a doctor for an allergy shot. With TV poll numbers showing deep voter anxiety over Bill Clinton's character, campaign officials say the strategy between now and next Tuesday is to use the debates to let the people of New York see the real Bill Clinton. There will also be a weekend stop in Albany for a meeting with Governor Mario Cuomo. It is clearly a picture the Clinton campaign feels it needs. Gene Randall, CNN, New York.
The White House is denouncing a congressional inquiry into its expenses. A spokeswoman says the Democrats are trying to deflect criticism from their own mismanagement on Capitol Hill. 5 White House officials called to testify about travel boycotted a House committee hearing today. Democrats say the purpose of the hearing was to determine ways to curtail presidential excesses. A Supreme Court ruling could affect school systems nationwide. By a unanimous vote today, the justices decided to lift court supervision of student desegregation in DeKalb County, Georgia. The decision means school systems can be declared legally integrated on a step-by-step basis, even though some degree of racial inequality may exist. The Los Angeles police officer accused of striking the most blows at motorist Rodney King testified today he feared for his life. Officer Lawrence Powell said King attacked him and appeared to be on the hallucinogenic drug PCP. Powell also testified he denied that he laughed when he called for an ambulance.
Are you telling the jury here, as you sit here and testify, that's not laughter on that tape?
I'm saying I don't recall laughter, and I'm saying that's not laughter.
Okay. So not only do you not recall laughter, when you hear this tape, you don't even hear any laughter.
That's correct.
Okay, you don't hear laughter after the word beating, and you don't hear laughter after you say numerous head wounds.
No, I sure don't.
3 other officers are on trial with Powell. Mike Tyson won't be leaving prison anytime soon. The Indiana Court of Appeals has denied the boxer's request to be released on bail as he appeals his rape conviction. The court didn't explain its decision in the brief order. Prosecutors say by refusing to eat and passing out autographs to inmates, Tyson is showing he isn't suitable to be released on bond. His lawyers may appeal next to Indiana's Supreme Court. In New York, the jury that will decide John Gotti's fate is ready to begin deliberating. Jurors received their instructions this afternoon after the judge dismissed one juror. Gotti is accused of murder, loan sharking, gambling, tax fraud, and other charges. A newly released 4-year-old survey shows condoms are still not widely used by sexually active male teenagers. The U.S. Public Health Service surveyed about 1,900 teenagers. They found the average male teenager used condoms during sex about half the time. Overall, the survey of 15 to 19-year-old males found about 2/3 of sexual encounters occur without a condom. The survey also found condom use is higher among black males than white. A New York high school student thought the vast improvement in his SAT score was cause for celebration. But Norma Quarles reports it caused the testing company to think he cheated.
Brian Dalton scores way above average when it comes to swimming, and a partial sampling of his high school swimming trophies can attest to that. But the 18-year-old high school senior, hoping for a swimming scholarship to St. John's University, is going to court in May in a legal dispute over some different scores, his Scholastic Aptitude Test scores. In May, he took the SATs and scored poorly, with a total of 620. After taking the Princeton Review course, he retook the SATs in November and this time scored a 1030. The 400-point jump set off bells and whistles at the Educational Testing Service, and now it won't release his scores to colleges pending an investigation.
ETS are the last people in the country who believe that you can't prepare for the SAT, that it's impossible to raise your scores. Somebody improves 400 points, they go, oh, he must have cheated. In fact, you can't prepare.
Brian says he had mononucleosis when he took the first test.
I wasn't feeling too well. I was tired, and I wasn't ready to sit for a 4-hour test.
He attended the 6-week course at Princeton Review, where he boned up and got some test-taking tips.
If I flip a coin 100 times, and the first 99 times it comes up heads, what are the odds that it's going to come up heads again? 1 and 2. The odds don't change.
Brian says he gained a lot of confidence.
The last class of the Princeton, I went up to my teachers, and they said, Brian, you're going to be capable of getting 1,000 or above. And that's what I did. And now I'm being accused of not taking the test.
If Brian Dalton had somebody take the SAT for him, then he had somebody take the Princeton Review for him, too.
Brian's parents are suing to have the grades released.
They're accusing him of cheating, lying, and a fraud. And I don't care how big they are. I am fighting them.
The president of NYU says he doesn't give too much weight to SAT scores.
I would never want to make that judgment on the basis of an SAT test alone.
Brian Dalton's lawyer is confident his client will win this one. The Educational Testing Service insists it has evidence that will come out at the trial. Norma Quarles, CNN, New York.
Libyan television is accusing the United Nations Security Council of violating international law. The council voted today to impose sanctions on Libya to force it to surrender 2 suspects in the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. The vote was 10-0, with 5 abstentions. The sanctions prohibit flights to Libya, except for humanitarian reasons, and they stop shipment of aircraft supplies and components. They also outlaw sales of weapons and military equipment to the country and call on UN member states to expel most Libyan diplomats. The sanctions are scheduled to take effect on April 15th. The 2 Libyan suspects have been indicted by Britain and the United States.
But Governor Brown, Governor Brown, there will be closing statements for this. Is a tax on business. We will have not on poor people.
Kansas and Wisconsin also have primaries next Tuesday. The Supreme Court says a Georgia county school system's effort to desegregate its student population no longer needs court supervision. In a unanimous decision, the High Court ruled public schools can achieve racial integration gradually. Anthony Collins has that.
In DeKalb County, Georgia, and hundreds of other public school districts around the United States, School systems no longer need to achieve full integration before they begin to end court-ordered desegregation step by step. That was the unanimous opinion of the Supreme Court. It was a ruling that could clear the way for an end to busing at some schools.
As it applies to the DeKalb County School District, it says that we have done the right thing for a number of years, that we have met the goal in student assignment, and that aspect should be behind us.
I don't think there's any question, and I think even the Supreme Court would concede that the schools in DeKalb County today are both separate and unequal. The only question in this case is, are we going to cure that situation? And the Supreme Court has left us with some rules that suggest we may be able to cure that and we may not.
The decision said DeKalb County schools are freed from court-ordered integration of student enrollment because the school had done enough to try to achieve that. It said any remaining racial imbalance in student enrollment was due to population shift.
CNN Headline News. I'm Lynne Russell. The prosecution is putting a new spin on the brutality trial of 4 Los Angeles police officers accused of beating motorist Rodney King. During questioning of the youngest of the officers today, prosecutors introduced racially tinged intercar messages the officer had exchanged with a friend. Defense attorneys protested, but as Greg Lamont reports, they were overruled.
For the first time in the trial of 4 white police officers accused of beating a black motorist, the issue of possible racial motivation has been raised. In what could prove to be a critical error for his client, Attorney Michael Stone engaged in a line of questioning that allowed the prosecution to introduce computer messages into evidence. Messages sent and received by Officer Lawrence Powell just before and after the beating of Rodney King.
So you remember this conversation, don't you?
I remember the conversation, yes.
All right. And you replied to her, sounds almost as exciting as our last call. It was right out of Gorillas in the Mist. That's what you typed into her, isn't it?
Yes.
And she typed back, ha, 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 ha. Let me guess who be the parties. You remember that, don't you?
Yes.
Now, this incident that you're referring to, this last call right out of Gorillas in the Mist, it involved a family of African Americans, didn't it?
Yes, did.
All right. And in your description of these individuals, you called them gorillas, didn't you?
No.
Following King's beating, Powell, who was seen delivering most of the baton blows in the videotape that was introduced into evidence, sent another message. It read, I haven't beaten anyone this bad in a long time.
Officer Powell, you used excessive force when you beat Rodney King, didn't you?
No, sir.
Officer Powell, you used inappropriate conduct in that incident with Rodney King, didn't you?
No, sir.
Why did you tell Karina Smith, I haven't beaten anyone this bad in a long time? Why did you use the word beaten?
That's a common police jargon when you talk from policeman to policeman, kind of a professional jargon.
During direct testimony, Powell said the blows he inflicted on King were justified because he was afraid there was going to be a gun battle.
I was completely in fear for my life, scared to death that if this guy got back up, he was going to take my gun away from me, or there was going to be a shooting, and I was doing everything I could to keep him down on the ground.
Powell said he was just doing what his sergeant had ordered.
The purpose of hitting his legs, in your mind, was?
Because Sergeant Kuhn had told me to keep him down on the ground.
Well, did you understand what he was trying to tell you to do?
Objection calls for conclusion. Overruled.
I understood that he was controlling the situation and in ordering us to keep him down on the ground by hitting those joints. He had control of the use of force that was going on.
Under questioning by his attorney, Powell seemed nervous but assured of his answers. Such was not the case under cross-examination, which will continue Wednesday. Greg Lamont, CNN, Simi Valley, California.
Mike Tyson will remain in prison while he appeals his convictions for rape and criminal deviant conduct. Today, the Indiana Court of Appeals rejected the former boxing champion's request to be freed on bail. The court didn't explain. Tyson's attorneys are expected to appeal the decision to Indiana's Supreme Court. In Miami, one more day of closing arguments is expected before the jury in Manuel Noriega's drug trafficking trial gets the case. Today, prosecutors described the former Panamanian dictator as a crooked cop who sold military protection to the Medellin drug cartel. The defense is expected to wrap up 7 months of proceedings tomorrow with its closing arguments. A Supreme Court ruling could affect school systems nationwide. In a unanimous decision today, the justices voted to lift court supervision of student desegregation in DeKalb County, Georgia. The decision means school systems can be declared legally integrated on a step-by-step basis, allowing federal court supervision over student assignments to end, while supervision over other desegregation aspects remains. The ruling could provide school districts with a way to end forced busing before they meet all aspects of a judge's desegregation order. The White House is refusing to answer to Congress about its travel budget. 5 administration officials ignored invitations to testify today before a House subcommittee. So Democratic representatives addressed their questions to empty chairs. They say the White House conceals some of its travel budget in military accounts. They also complained about the president's 5 florists and 5 calligraphers. Republicans didn't like it.
This is politically motivated. There's no question about it. They're trying to divert attention away from the scandals of the U.S. House of Representatives down to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to get this monkey off their backs.
The Bush administration says officials already have defended their budget to Congress. In Vermont, the state's Democrats and Republicans are picking national convention delegates tonight, 14 and 19 respectively. President Bush is running unchallenged. Jerry Brown apparently has won the most delegates on the Democratic side. The latest returns show that with 86% of the precincts reporting, Jerry Brown has 6 delegates to Bill Clinton's 3. Paul Tsongas, who dropped out of the race and wasn't actively campaigning, didn't come up with any delegates. 4 would be uncommitted. Jerry Brown told union leaders today Bill Clinton stands for a, quote, low-wage, chummy, old boy network. Then Brown returned to New York for a debate doubleheader with Clinton. Clinton denounced the Bush administration's policy toward Israel. He told a Jewish group U.S. pressure on Israel to stop building settlements had severely damaged relations between the countries. Brown says Clinton's newfound willingness to debate is a mark of desperation. But the frontrunner, Clinton, says he's just trying to bypass the Big Apple's tabloids. More on all this from Richard Roth.
It's getting so you can't tell who is Bill Clinton's opponent in the New York primary.
I have been trashed there in the tabloids. The voters here in New York, all they know is the tabloid trash and the whipping I've taken here day in and day out in the papers.
The tabloids deny they are talking trash.
False. I think that's absolutely false. I think that he's being subjected to standard, vigorous New York City coverage and is not used to that.
I think he's completely wrong. I think it's a laughable response. There are more Pulitzer Prize winners in this city than anywhere else in America.
Unlike Little Rock, Arkansas, New York City has 4 major newspapers and 6 television stations and countless radio and magazines all competing for attention.
This is the Tower of Babel of journalism, and we're not going to change. He's got to adjust to us.
The Clinton camp is avoiding them, if possible, by staging debates.
Go over the heads of the tabloids and to the people. Let them see the real Bill Clinton. Let them compare him to Jerry Brown.
But a new ad released by the Clinton side tries to capitalize on the newspapers.
He stood up to the tabloids, the false attacks, told the truth, and shown real character. Bill Clinton.
The Clinton camp says it was ready for the New York press, but is surprised by the intensity. There are no headlines like this in Little Rock, or even cartoonists. And it could be the columnists with their razor's edge tone that irritates the governor the most, or Slick Willie, as he is more commonly known in the inside pages.
I've written very tough things about him. It's my intention to get the election reopened. That's what Americans want. And I think we're doing the work of the voters here.
And the potential voters don't seem to think the tabloids are doing anything but reporting facts.
I think that New York media coverage is usually very fair.
Anytime you want to be in the limelight, you got to take good conduct.
The tabloid press point out that Bill Clinton should be more concerned with papers like the New York Times and Washington Post, which have raised questions about the governor in their own stories. Bill Clinton can only hope other famous people make news of their own for the next week. Richard Roth, CNN, New York.
Libyan television is accusing the United Nations Security Council of violating international law. The council voted today to impose sanctions on Libya. CNN Headline News. I'm Lynne Russell. Democrats in the House of Representatives are turning the political tables on Republicans, in particular President Bush. With their checking accounts under investigation, Democrats are scrutinizing the president's travel budget. As Jamie McIntyre reports, Republicans are calling that one foul play.
question. If it costs $50,000 an hour to fly Air Force One, how come the line item for presidential travel in the latest budget totals only $29,000 for an entire year? Democrats say they know the money comes from someplace else, but where?
When we examined the White House, we found no existing records which would indicate an explanation of their expenses.
Much of the president's travel costs are hidden in other budgets. The Air Force pays for the plane, the Marine Corps for the helicopter, the General Services Administration for the fleet of limousines. At a subcommittee hearing staged by Democrats, charts put the actual cost of executive travel at $72 million a year, more than twice what Congress spends. And a calendar of the president's trips purported to show most were political. That was too much for the only Republican in attendance.
This is politically motivated. There's no question about it. They're trying to divert attention away from the scandals of the U.S. House of Representatives down to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to get this monkey off their backs.
I want to emphasize that that has never been the intention of this hearing. This hearing was long planned more than 2 months ago. The president was notified more than 2 months ago.
5 empty chairs were set for White House budget officials who didn't show. An administration spokesperson explained they couldn't make it because of competing demands from so many congressional committees. House Democrats immediately took to the floor to denounce what they said was the real reason.
A glance into the opulence of executive branch staff and public servants shows undersecretaries being ferried around our streets by limousines. The White House shorting taxpayers millions of dollars in reimbursements for their political and fundraising travels. Private dining rooms for cabinet secretaries. A White House with full-time florists and 4 calligraphers.
But Democrats on the subcommittee insist they're not going after White House perks. They simply want to know where the money's coming from.
By the time we're finished, at least this authorizing committee will be authorizing real numbers.
The subcommittee chairman says he'll ask the White House to reconsider his invitation to explain the president's travel budget. And if that fails, he says he'll consider issuing subpoenas next week. Jamie McIntyre, CNN, Capitol Hill.
The controversy over the House Post Office continues to grow. A new government audit found an unlocked vault containing $75,000 in money orders at the Rayburn Building Post Office. Government officials also determined the chief clerk at the Longworth office, who stepped down Friday, took the keys to the cash stamp drawer. As a result, the audit couldn't be completed, and as much as $59,000 could be missing. It appears Vermont will hand former California Governor Jerry Brown his 3rd Democratic presidential caucus win tonight. Brown, who's won caucuses in Maine and Nevada, as well as primaries in Colorado and Connecticut, leads Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. Checking the latest results now, with 93% of the precincts reporting, Jerry Brown leads with 6 delegates. Bill Clinton has 3. 4 delegates are uncommitted. A total of 14 are at stake. The focus of the Jerry Brown and Bill Clinton campaigns today was not Vermont, but New York. The Democratic candidates went head-to-head in 2 debates broadcast across the state. In New York, Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, they all hold primaries next week. Earlier, Jerry Brown pushed his pro-labor record at a meeting with union leaders in Washington, while Clinton addressed New York Jewish leaders, criticizing the Bush administration's treatment of Israel. Clinton declined comment on whether he supports or opposes a Palestinian state. A Supreme Court ruling could affect school systems nationwide. By a unanimous vote today, the justices agreed to lift court supervision of student desegregation in DeKalb County, Georgia. The decision means school systems can be declared legally integrated on a step-by-step basis, even though some degree of racial inequality may exist. While DeKalb County doesn't have forced busing, the ruling could provide school districts with a way to end busing before they meet all aspects of a judge's desegregation order. Attorneys for convicted rapist Mike Tyson are expressing optimism their client's conviction ultimately will be reversed, despite a legal setback today. The Indiana Court of Appeals denied Tyson's request to be free on bond while the appeal is going on. Tyson's attorneys are expected to take their bail request to Indiana's Supreme Court. Astronauts aboard the space shuttle Atlantis will begin gearing down and packing up in a couple of hours. They're scheduled to return to Earth Thursday morning. Mission scientist Marcia Torr says the crew has collected enough data so far to fill 5 18-wheel trucks floor to ceiling. Tony Clark has more on today's activities.
Once again, payload bay views.
It's been smooth sailing for the crew of Atlantis as they orbit the Earth every 90 minutes. Tuesday would have been a day for wrapping up experiments and beginning to pack for the return home. But instead, the crew's getting an extra day in space, and scientists get an extra day of observations.
We're going to be able to spend those 16 orbits so that each of the investigations gets something additional that is of great value to them.
During nighttime passes, the crew photographed auroras. And just to be sure they got good data, payload managers called on some unconventional techniques.
You might try a little more of that zero-G dancing on your end to see if we can get the aurora to come up. We also have some calls in around the world to see if there are any other techniques available.
Okay, we know last time that it worked, so let's try again.
It's that playful attitude that's eased the heavy workload on this round-the-clock shuttle mission. Weightlessness provides the perfect environment for freestyle flips. And as astronaut Kathy Sullivan showed, it gives a whole new meaning to light lunches.
Atlantis Houston for Charlie.
This is the last shuttle mission under NASA Administrator Richard Truly. Truly, who helped rebuild the space agency after the Challenger explosion, was asked to step down after disputes with the Space Council and Vice President Quayle.
All I can say is keep up the great work, and I have loved every minute of it.
This last shuttle mission under Truly is itself a beginning for NASA. It is the start of the space agency's mission to planet Earth, a 10-year-long study focusing not on the moon and stars, but on the Earth and the changes the Earth is undergoing. Tony Clark, CNN, reporting.
The breakup of the Soviet Union and U.S. defense cuts have signaled the end for the USS Missouri. America's last active battleship was decommissioned for a second time today in ceremonies at Long Beach Naval Station in California. Mighty Mo has an historic past. Japan formally surrendered on its deck in 1945. The UN Security Council has voted unanimously to slap sanctions on Libya for supporting terrorism. China and 4 third world countries abstained. The UN could enforce the sanctions militarily after they take effect on April 15th. The resolution doesn't prohibit trade with Libya, but it bans air travel except for humanitarian flights, and it stops deliveries of aircraft supplies. It also bans sales or transfers of weapons, ammunition, and military equipment to Libya, and it requires other nations to reduce diplomatic contacts with Muammar Gaddafi's regime. To reverse the sanctions, Libya would have to surrender 2 agents wanting for the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, and it must cooperate with the investigation into the 1989 bombing of a French plane. UN and Pentagon officials say Saddam Hussein's troops are intensifying their attacks on Kurdish rebels in northern Iraq, but the U.S. military can't confirm United Nations reports that Iraq.
CNN Headline News. I'm David Goodnow. Libya faces an April 15th deadline. The United Nations Security Council has voted to impose an air and arms embargo on that day if Tripoli refuses to turn over 2 suspects in the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. Muammar Gaddafi's government is denouncing the move as unfair and unjust. Here's more from Jeannie Mose.
Colonel Gaddafi now knows how Saddam Hussein felt. Libya is being slapped with sanctions by the UN Security Council. Western diplomats call it poetic justice. Libya is accused of involvement in blowing up Pan Am 103, so the resolution calls for all countries to cut air links with Libya. Nations are also supposed to stop selling Libya weapons and reduce the number of Libyan diplomatic staff they allow in. The vote was less than overwhelming. You need 9 votes to pass a resolution. This one got 10. No one voted against, but 5 countries abstained, countries that thought imposing sanctions was too rash, that maybe with more time, Colonel Gaddafi would turn over the 2 suspects in the Pan Am bombing.
On the eve of this meeting, certain positive results were almost being produced.
Almost, but not quite. There is still time for Libya to avoid the sanctions. They don't actually go into effect until April 15th, which gives Libya about 2 weeks to turn over the suspects and renounce terrorism.
The choice is now clearly and unavoidably up to Libya.
What isn't clear is how Libya will demonstrate by concrete actions as the resolution demands its renunciation of terrorism. Libya's ambassador said his government has cooperated as much as it could without compromising its sovereignty, and he suggested Libya might end up under attack.
The attempt to smear my country's reputation is but paving the way to another act of aggression against peaceful Libyan cities.
As when hundreds of Libyan civilians were killed back in 1986, the ambassador said. Back then, the U.S. bombed Libya after a terrorist attack on a German discotheque where Americans hung out. Some relatives of the Pan Am victims were satisfied for the moment. Others thought the sanctions don't go far enough.
I think the key here is that the one thing that has been left out is what we need is an oil embargo. That's the key.
But an oil embargo would probably never have made it through the Security Council, so the U.S. had to settle for the isolation rather than the economic strangulation of Libya. Unless he backs down over the next 2 weeks, Colonel Gaddafi will have his wings clipped. Jeannie Moe, CNN at the United Nations.
The United Nations also wants Libya to surrender 4 men suspected of blowing up a French airliner in September 1989. The UTA flight exploded over Niger, Africa, killing 171 people. UN officials say Baghdad is trying to disrupt Kurdish elections scheduled for April 30th. They say Baghdad is attacking Kurdish villages ahead of the elections for an independent parliament. Pentagon officials confirm reports of renewed fighting, but they cannot confirm reports that Iraqi forces have crossed the 36th parallel into U.S.-controlled territory. Such a move, if that's true, would violate the Gulf War ceasefire agreement. Russian President Boris Yeltsin said the danger of fragmentation no longer looms over Russia. Today he signed a federation treaty with 18 of Russia's 20 ethnic regions. 2 breakaway regions, Tatarstan and Chechen, refused to sign. Yeltsin doesn't have long to savor this political victory, though. He faces tough challenges in the Russian Congress of People's Deputies, which opens on Monday. That's the first meeting of the parliament since the Soviet Union's collapse, and Yeltsin began moving Russia's economy toward a free market system. As Yeltsin and regional leaders signed the treaty, ethnic violence continued across the Commonwealth of Independent States. In Moldova, 2 people were killed in clashes between loyalist troops and separatist Slavs. Fighting in Chechen, Nagorno-Karabakh, Georgia, and Tajikistan also claimed several lives. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus have assured Defense Secretary Dick Cheney they'll complete the transfer of all former Soviet tactical weapons, nuclear weapons, to Russia by July 1st. Cheney met with his counterparts from the 3 republics in Brussels. No word on when the shipments, which Ukraine stopped, will resume. The tiny state of Vermont is giving Jerry Brown a little bit of momentum going into next Tuesday's primaries in New York, Wisconsin, and Kansas. Only 14 Democratic delegates were up for grabs in tonight's caucuses. Brown picked up more than Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, who still holds a massive delegate lead. Based on the latest returns, looks like Brown will come away with 6 delegates, Clinton 3 with 4 uncommitted. 1 delegate is undetermined. Brown and Clinton met in 2 televised debates in New York, which will send 244 delegates to the Democratic convention. Clinton complained he's getting more scrutiny than Brown because, as the front runner, he's perceived as the establishment insider. In tonight's debate, 2 minor candidates protested being left out, and one, Larry Agron, was arrested. The 2 major rivals squared off on Brown's 13% flat tax plan and disagreed on gun control.
I think you should pass the Brady bill, and then I think there should be a nationwide attempt to engage the young people of our country in these massive gun buyback programs. I think that incentives should be offered.
In concept, does the idea work? It doesn't seem to have worked. I mean, it's a nice thing to try, but again, if you grow up in a neighborhood and your father's out of work and most of the people in the block are too, and the greatest self-esteem comes from being in a gang, and the only challenge to your manhood is using a gun or getting in a gang fight, you have produced an impossible social pathology.
The organizer of one of today's Democratic debates said he convened it for one reason, so that city dwellers can hear the candidate's urban agenda. Brian Jenkins has that.
Before the campaign hit the home stretch to the New York primary, it often seemed to big city voters that this year's presidential candidates considered urban a 4-letter word.
The last 2 decades has made a cry for support of urban America to seem like some kind of special interest. The fact that almost 80% of Americans live in and around large metropolitan areas seems lost on everybody.
But the dogfight for the hearts and minds of New York Democrats has forced Jerry Brown and Bill Clinton to face up squarely to urban issues at the risk of turning off suburban and upstate voters.
This country has been divided for the last 11 years at every election time. Suburb against city, men against women, blacks and Hispanics against whites, the whole 9 yards.
I've been coming to this city for the last 30 years. It's going downhill, not because of the mayor, not because of the governor, but because of the inadequate commitment to invest in our cities.
Brown essentially backs the restoration of federal funds for cities as outlined by the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Clinton strikes similar notes with his urban agenda, encouraging small businesses in big cities, boosting local law enforcement, improving inner-city schools and housing and health care.
They take their jobs with them.
But the president of the New York City borough of the Bronx doesn't think either candidate has said nearly enough about urban problems, so Fernando Ferrer has organized a Democratic debate to focus on those concerns.
I think what people in cities desperately want to hear is one of these men who would be president of the United States really cares about the way they live, really cares that assault weapons are on our streets, really cares that too many good people are out of work, really cares that our bridges and roadways are falling apart, that not enough housing is being built, that the federal government has literally walked away.
But city dwellers accounted for less than a third of the total vote in the last presidential election, while suburbanites cast nearly half of all ballots. Democrats know that come November, they need a big share of the suburban vote to win the White House, but also can't afford to skim over urban issues and leave their traditional big city backers sitting at home on Election Day. Brian Jenkins, CNN, New York.
Republican Pat Buchanan roused his slumbering campaign in Milwaukee today, conceding he can't win his party's nomination, but painting himself as a protest candidate. When Buchanan arrived in Minnesota, GOP officials urged him to abandon his campaign. The former media commentator refused. The Supreme Court has made it easier for judges to stop supervising the desegregation efforts of public schools. The decision ends federal court supervision over student enrollment in DeKalb County, Georgia, even though its schools have never been fully integrated. In today's 8-0 ruling, the justices said segregated districts can be integrated gradually. Justice Clarence Thomas did not vote because he had not joined the court when it heard the case. The Los Angeles police officer accused of delivering the most blows with a baton to Rodney King took the stand in his own defense today. Lawrence Powell told jurors he struck King because he was in fear for his life and because King attacked him. Powell testified he thought King was on the drug PCP, and he denied making fun of King.